Okay, welcome. This is the second PowerPoint or second presentation for Unit 12, which is current issues, which I've seen some really good work on so far. I'll talk you through the criteria that we're looking at in this section. It's kind of tying a few bits together. We're looking at P2 and M2, but we're kind of looking at maybe 3/4 of that. So it's about describing the influence of the media on a selected sport, or we'll choose football, and then explaining the influence of the media on football. Again, it's one of those topics where you could literally write a book on it, and you'd probably scratch the surface. So a lot of what I'm doing is kind of giving you the sort of key points and the key messages that I want you to get across in your work. What I've done, I've kind of followed the pattern of your workbooks. So what we're going to look at, the influence of media on football, and we're going to just look at television, which is the sort of part of your booklet which covers, and there'll be a few terms you might not sort of immediately recognise. So we're going to look at the effect of the media on participation, the effect of programming and broadcasting rights, the influence of the media on advertising and sponsorship. We'll look at the sort of relevance of punditry and talk shows. We'll look at this concept of spectatorism, about whether the media influences increasing numbers going to matches, and then we'll also have a quick look at how the media may influence certain rule changes. Now, I think if you address each one of these points up to a merit standard, you're going to end up with an assignment that's probably about sort of 7-8 pages long. It's a lot. So I think there's going to be a couple of areas where I think when you're attacking this assignment, give nice, good, clear explanations. And what you'll probably find is there's a couple of sections which you'll be able to sort of speak more fluently about. So there's somewhere I think you almost just sort of need to show an awareness of the concept, and others where you can kind of dig in a little bit deeper. So I think for the first 3 points, what I do is I'll just talk through one slide, give you a couple of points to consider, and then I've got a little planner that I would suggest you follow. And then the last 3, I'm just going to sort of talk through them, and that almost is your planner that you see in front of you. So hopefully it will make sense. It would be a good idea to have the workbook with you and the course book with you, and you can have the two things together and pause my sort of ramblings whenever you like, and make yourself some notes. So off we go. So number 1 asks you to consider the effect of the media, particularly in this case television, on participation. Now, again, this is something that people have done sort of huge academic studies on, and they've sort of done their PhD theses on this particular topic. So we have to just scratch the surface. In my mind, I think it's very difficult to determine if you're footballers, you play football, you've probably not known much else. You're bombarded with football, the sports pages are bombarded with football. But has that really driven your participation? I think it's very difficult to know. I think that drive to play football has always been there, and I think that's quite an important point to make. That actually, from its inception, early on, there was, without that media coverage, people still played. There was still kind of an obsession to sort of getting involved and playing football. So I think it's very difficult to sort of determine whether TV drives participation. I think we've had an opportunity quite recently to really have a look at whether raising coverage can do that. And I think particularly what I would say if I was attacking this assignment was, I'd say it's very difficult to say. We can't really tell if increased media coverage increases participation. It certainly increases sort of talk about football. It keeps it sort of in everyone's minds, but we just don't really see that link with participation. I think the way you can get into this assignment is to really investigate the effect that it's had on female participation. Again, the a big thing for women's football was the World Cup, and the success of the women's team in that, particularly in 2015, but also more recently we've seen really raised coverage of the women's game. There's a couple of articles I've linked to at the bottom just about increased participation, and when I send you this PowerPoint, I would like you to have a look at those links and just get some stats out of them. So I'm not spoon feeding you stats here, but the one nice quote from this was, the bronze medal winning Lionesses spoke of inspiring the next generation and creating a legacy. It says they certainly did just that, and the FA is here to foster that legacy. So the FA was using the sort of increased media profile of the women's team, but also alongside that increased profile, that increased media coverage, they also had a lot of work involved in sort of providing for female coaches, providing support for setting up clubs, making the provision of women's football a condition on certain development programs that they were putting in place. So whilst the media was really important in almost kind of promoting the women's game, promoting the stories of the players, it was part of a much wider strategy. So I think what I'd like you to do for this particular section is really sort of follow my planner here and just make sure you've covered each bit. It needs a little bit of research from you. So first up, I would explain that football is the most attended sport or watched sport in the world. It's the #1 participation sport as well. But we just don't know the extent to which TV coverage drives that participation, or whether it just is. I would say that there's some evidence to show that increased coverage has raised participation numbers in women's football. This has been as that really sort of positive message has been shown. I think what's been interesting to me about how the women's game is covered is how they really sort of kind of get to know the players much more than perhaps they once did. They become much more like role models. You can see girls want to be like them, and I think that's really interesting. I've put here in that second point as well about finding evidence that increased TV coverage increases participation. So I think you'll find that for women's football. I think there's also the hint that it happened with boys gymnastics after the Olympics. Actually, there are some really positive stories coming out of that, and it would be interesting to sort of really sort of reference that, just to say actually what has been seen is that participation numbers almost kind of rise as there's this raised media profile. So the third point I was saying, provide some figures to back up that increase in female participation. And I've put also for that fourth point, it may be worth stating that the FA also provided a number of other strategies to capture the interest in female football. So it's not like, the Women's World Cup happened and that was it. The point was that to capture that increased interest, there was a lot of campaigns and a lot of events that sort of kept that sort of momentum going. So it didn't sort of happen in isolation. If you're summarising this idea about how media can sort of raise participation, you might sort of question this bottom point. I think it's quite interesting. Yeah, it's not something you have to talk about, but I was just sort of doing some research, and it looks like in the sort of that real sort of key age group, 11 to 15, basketball was the second most popular sport. Now, I sort of think actually, if I wanted to watch basketball for this country, I wouldn't know where to go. I wouldn't know where to watch it. And so that's a sport that's quite interesting in my mind, is that, I think it's very popular because it's a good sport. People want to play it because it's easy to pick up. There is quite a glamorous side certainly in the American game, and you can get some sort of some coverage there. But I don't think people are taking up basketball in this country because of what they see of English players playing basketball. So I think that might be quite an interesting thing to just sort of consider within your essay. So the main thing to get across is, I think, particularly to see if you can give evidence of participation levels rising due to extra media coverage. And I think in my mind the only way that you can really see that is going to be in the most recent sort of women's football and the games that we've seen. So the next bit you're asked to consider is how the media, the media influences football, and particularly with respect to the programming and broadcasting rights. Again, this is such a huge topic. I think the main thing to get across is one. I think there's two strands. One is how much the TV rights have changed over the years, and how that now influences the sort of programming of the sport. So the first thing to say is that matches always used to take place at 3 p.m. on Saturday, or 4, around, I don't know, one of those two. And a lot of that was driven by the people's work patterns. So we looked a little bit about the Industrial Revolution, and we saw that the work patterns, as people moved into these sort of urbanized environments, meant that everyone got that Saturday afternoon off, so everyone could go and watch the match. Now, that was sort of kind of held quite sacred for a long time, and you've also got to put it in context of the time. You know, Sunday trading has only been allowed, I think, within the last 20 or 30 years or so. So up until the 1970s, I think it was 1974, there was no top flight matches on a Sunday, and it wasn't even a big thing when they did come in. There was just sort of 1 or 2 matches started to kind of trickle in on Sundays. So I think there's two things happening at a similar time, and I want you to sort of capture this in your essay. So number one, we just look at just consider the rights to begin with. So there was very little televised football. The early televised football, we've got to think that people didn't really have television sets until the sort of 50s and 60s. There was some televised football much earlier. But there were problems broadcasting it outside of London, so the transmitters wouldn't go that far. You didn't have satellites to broadcast these things. But early sort of matches, we saw early international matches, a couple of FA Cup finals that were televised, and that really showed the kind of thirst people had to watch football. It was a big thing. So there was an early attempt by ITV to capture a deal to televise football. So they had a deal worth about £150,000 to get basically a season's worth of matches, or around a season's worth. So 26 matches. And the way it was organised was they weren't actually allowed to screen the match at the same time it was happening. So there was a sort of slight delay, and a bit of that was one of the fears, particularly from the I think it's the Burnley chairman, I think I've got it on the next slide, was that they felt that televising matches would just mean people wouldn't go, so you'd lose a lot of that gate receipts. So at the time, you know, that 150,000, it wasn't really very widely shared amongst the clubs. So the FA would take a big slice, the league would take a big slice. You know, it wasn't the same sort of figures that we consider now. Gate receipts were all for clubs. There was very little sponsorship. It was really about the tickets on the turnstile. So there was this early sort of attempt to televise, but really the success of the 1966 World Cup showed this absolutely vast market for televised football. And what I'd like you to do, if possible, I want you to sort of just really explain that from that point, there was more and more televised football, and the gradually the commercial worth began to be seen. So over that sort of time, it was a sort of steady growth, but nothing huge. But now, what happened in the early 90s? So in 1992, there was no, in the early 90s, there was no Sky TV. So you essentially had 4 channels. You had BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, Channel 4. So at that time, satellite television was coming in to sort of follow the model that had been kind of pioneered in America, where they don't have a sort of state broadcaster as such. And really to sort of, it was failing actually. The original Sky wasn't doing well. It was sort of really sort of chugging along. But what saved it was that they wanted to invest in football. They saw that actually that football was dominating the back pages. If they could get football on their screens, people would start buying satellite dishes. You used to have a satellite dish on your house. It wasn't sort of plugged in through the internet. So they had to sell these satellite dishes, sell these receivers, and to do that, they wanted to get football. So the Premier League was created. So they sort of convinced, if you like, the top 20 clubs in the country to create this kind of breakaway Premier League. And as part of that league, they bought the rights to sort of to show the Premier League matches, and they put in an absolutely ginormous bid, and they won. So they got it. So Sky suddenly held the rights to televised games. They pumped in just an extraordinary amount of money. Now this gave them a certain amount of power, if you like, over the football clubs, and certainly over the league actually. So they were sort of combined with the league. They essentially financed so much of the clubs now through this sort of cash input that they could start to dictate the programming schedules. So now, whereas I guess maybe before, maybe 90% of matches were at 3 p.m. on Saturday, they really had to start getting their money's worth. So they'd start to see matches on sort of Mondays, and they'll start to get them in on Sundays. So this thing that we see, this kind of Super Sunday, that's just such a huge thing in this country, has really only been in the last probably sort of 25 years, maybe 30. And it's something that's actually grown and grown. There used to be sort of one match on a Sunday, now two, and now it's just sort of crammed in. It's like a whole fiesta of football. So essentially, by Sky providing all that additional money, that kind of gives them a certain amount of influence over the programming. So I really want you to get across that point in your work, is that essentially the sort of modern structure we see of kind of most nights there seems to be a match, has really built around largely the fact that the broadcasters have so much power now. So on the planner, there's a few points that I want you to get across. So the first one is just really just say when the first matches were shown. When were the first matches shown on TV? You don't have to, it's not a history lesson here, but just give me an idea about when the first matches were shown and what sort of things they were. This is very easily researched. I've got a link at the bottom which kind of you can find that straight away. Explain the fears that clubs had. So the third point down, I've kind of nicked that from Wikipedia, is that essentially this is a sort of Burnley chairman in the 60s sort of felt that there'd be a negative effect on TV audiences. On sort of gate receipts. And so we've kind of held that ever since. You still don't get matches at 3 p.m. on a Saturday. So the thing to get across is that that's still in place. That's sort of that's sacred. But the thing you need to get across is explain how the sizes of deals have changed over the years, and whereas now there's billions involved, so the TV companies provide so much money that actually to get their money's worth and to be able to pump those sums into the league, they need to be able to provide more opportunities for viewing, and that means more midweek games. That means more kind of staggered weekend games. So you might see sort of a game at 12, 3, 5 on the same day. And also as the importance of European matches really increase. Companies often will have some European matches, some sort of home league matches on their sort of schedule. And so they sort of reflect that in their programming a little bit more. So they're the main things to get across. There's a section that asks you to look at advertising and sponsorship, so the effect of the media on football, and particularly with respect to advertising and sponsorship. Again, this is a real huge thing. I'm just trying to give you a start point and give you some ideas that you can include in your work. So I would, football as we know it is global. So the reach is huge. Now, I've got 3 shirts on there. You can give yourself a point if you can recognise each one. But we've got Arsenal, who've got a JVC sort of sponsor. We've got Liverpool, who've got Crown Paints, and then West Bromwich Albion. This is in the 80s, and they had the no smoking campaign. So a lot of shirt manufacturers were kind of there to promote a product in England or in the UK. It was almost like you'd have a large Japanese company like JVC, a sort of electrical goods manufacturer, and they would want to sell their goods into the UK. And that's, there's still an element of that. Companies use brands to promote themselves. But some, what's interesting is if you go on holiday to, I've, been, where did I go recently? Sri Lanka. You sort of talk to a cabbie and they'd sort of go, which club do you support? And it would always be, which English club? Who is it? Manchester United, Liverpool, who? So actually now the sponsored names are not just about raising awareness of products in the home country. It's really about raising awareness on the global scale. So particularly if you look at some of the some of the larger clubs, the sponsors aren't, they're promoting on a global scale now. So I've got an example on the third one here that some sponsors aren't even available in the UK. So I think King Power is some sort of duty-free empire in Thailand. So that's raising that profile. We're not all going to run down to King Power and start stocking up on booze. This is an international thing. So the sponsors kind of using Leicester in this case to promote on the global scale. So I think the important thing to get across is that the media has, in a sense, allowed football to be promoted on this huge global scale now. So when we look at the size of some advertising deals, you think, well, actually, yeah, these are brands that are global in their reach. So I think it's important to just look at the scale of the sums involved. I've linked here again. There's a really nice sort of just explanation of the sums involved with each different club, who sponsors them, how much they get, what that means. I've got there that Manchester City, they sell their sleeve for 10 million a year. So they just have a tiny little emblem on the side of their sleeve. I forget which sponsor it is, but they pay 10 million a year. And there's some absolutely vast sums knocking about because these are such huge scale brands. I've got this picture up just because I want you to just sort of think about what you associate when you see those sports and those brands together. Tennis has always got, it really always gets very sort of high-end luxury brands. So I don't know who the player is actually, but he's playing in front of a Rolex sort of board. And these brands always use tennis because it's, it kind of reflects their values. It attracts a certain type of punter. It sort of always reflects well. Tennis players are always usually fairly well behaved. They sort of show good sportsmanship generally. I've got Tag Heuer and Formula One. Again, sort of a glamorous lifestyle. Very quite technical in the way. So by associating with that sport, it shows them to be technologically kind of advanced and what have you. I've got Rory McIlroy, who's got a Jumeirah, some sort of resort on his cap. You must pay him millions of pounds to associate with him. and I've got Usain Bolt at the bottom, sort of associating with Puma. So brands sort of build up their image by associating with sports people, and in football's case by associating with teams. So I think it's important in your explanation. I've got a planner over here, is to explain why firms might want to associate with football. Particularly, it's that global audience. It's the most watched game in the world. It has global reach. Think about the positive associations. Why would someone want to sort of associate with certain football clubs and maybe not with others? I've got a link here. So why have Manchester City teamed up with a company called Turtle Beach? Turtle Beach are really big in esports, and Manchester City are really keen to get involved in esports as well. So there might be sort of mutually beneficial arrangements. So it's useful to describe the size of the early sponsorship and early advertising deals. So who was the first shirt sponsor? And then explain the size of current deals. So who's got the biggest current shirt deal? You could say who's got the lowest. And I want you to explain the benefits that brings. So that obviously brings money, but there might be some pitfalls. If you're a sponsor and you've paid, let's say, 20 million over a period of time, let's say you're, I don't know, let's say, there was a case recently actually, I forget which footballer it was, playing for one of the German clubs, and as part of their sponsorship deal, everyone gets an Audi. So he turned up for work, or he turned up for training in his Lamborghini, and he got fined 2 weeks, I think it was a week's wages or something, I don't know, because he was going against that sponsorship deal. So sponsors need people to behave in a certain way. They need the people that they are sponsoring to uphold their values. So if you're a sponsor and you're bringing 20 million into a club and someone behaves very badly, that puts both parties in a very difficult position, doesn't it? So I want you to mention, maybe consider that. Also, maybe just have a look at the UEFA official partners. So what you'll see is that there are a group of real kind of mega-sized companies that are allowed to advertise alongside UEFA. So you can kind of think about the benefits that they get being part of that group, that idea about them associating with that real sort of pinnacle of sport at the highest level. You can see at the top, I've got Kidderminster Harriers with Hire It. This is my uncle's company, who's sponsored Kidderminster Harriers for many years. So you could sort of mention that he enjoys it. He likes it. So for him, in Kidderminster, his brand, they sort of hire out tools and the like. It's a way of getting noticed. It keeps him in the public eye, and he enjoys it. He has fun. It's a nice way of spending his a bit of money. It's a way of sort of spending his advertising budget, and as part of that spend, he gets to hang out at the club, gets to sort of meet the players, and gets to feel really involved. So for a lot of companies, there's quite a lot of of just excitement just being attached and involved with sport. So you're also asked to comment on punditry and talk shows. So you're asked to sort of show how the media affects the sport. So particularly more and more punditry is beginning to sort of become kind of enmeshed with the sport, and I think it's useful. I've got here, this is just a quick planner. I would start by just explaining that early match reporting was just that. It was just match reporting. So I've got a picture on the top of Jimmy Hill. This is on Match of the Day, and essentially what they're doing is they're almost kind of just relaying what happened. And lots of early sports reports were just that, just telling people what happened. Gradually, over the years, people realised that actually sometimes expert opinion is quite interesting. It's a nice way to while away a little time, just listening to people's ideas. And I think more and more there used to gradually the sort of level of analysis began to increase in football. Um, in the late 90s, there was a real shift. Previously, you'd have lots of sort of slightly older sort of sports broadcasters like sort of Des Lynam and David Coleman, that were sort of very respected broadcasters that possibly didn't have such a sort of playing background to what we see now. The 1998 World Cup, I think it was, there was a shift to a much younger sort of pundits and presenters. It was the last year that a reporter called Des Lynam was kind of in charge, but they had a real sort of cast of supporting pundits, much younger players, people who were very recently retired or recently sort of given up the game, and some sort of active managers, people still involved in the sport. They showed a more sort of international face to football, and they showed a lot, certainly with a player called Ruud Gullit and David Ginola. They showed a much more sort of sophisticated way of talking about the game, about presenting it to an audience, and people really enjoyed kind of listening to it and having that explanation of sport, having that explanation of the individual struggles and the explanation of the tactics. So over time it started to really increase in terms of the depth of analysis, but also the sort of the way that the game was explained to people. This sort of expansion kind of brings a couple of things. It kind of engages the audience a little bit more, and it also allows more time on screen. So particularly for the commercial broadcasters, there's more time for adverts, and people were kind of, you know, sort of more sort of glued into the match. It might be worth mentioning that now there's such a relationship between the pundits and the sport, that actually the pundits' comments now often make the back page. So they sort of ramp up the excitement. You start, certainly it seems like Jamie Carragher or Graham Souness is always involved in some sort of spat with some kind of player. You know, I've put here the pundit slam. So, you know, whereas previously this sort of expert opinion was more just sort of, you know, tactical, you know, now sometimes it seems a little bit more personal perhaps, and the press pick up on these much more and more. So in summary, it's a funny little topic to discuss, but I think what's really important is to get across the idea that early sports reporting was literally relaying. Over the years it's become much more kind of about a conversation about the game, and to a point where now the punditry is used to, one, inform the audience much more about the game, but also used to kind of ramp up that excitement, ramp up the tension in a match, you know, really emphasize the key battles, really sort of you know, pick apart what's happening in front. You know, you can see the way that Sky Sports sort of manages their sort of tension on a Super Sunday. It's quite interesting to watch their techniques. Last couple is a concept of spectatorism. So spectatorism is really this idea that about actually going to watch the match itself. I think this is one of the ones where you just sort of cover it in very brief detail. Go back to that original idea that in the 60s it was feared that too much football on telly would cause a decline in viewing, and for that reason there's still no matches shown at 3 p.m. on a Saturday. That was from a time when the broadcasters probably didn't give the clubs anywhere near as much money as now. So at that point, clubs were probably rightfully quite protective of their gate receipts. I've put there's a complex relationship exists between TV coverage and attendance. Certainly kind of event matches, you know, I kind of put it in the context of if Chesham Football Club were playing someone, like let's say they had a midweek FA Cup match and it was on telly, would I be more likely to watch it in the ground? I think I probably would, because you want to be there. You sort of want to be there at that event, and there's a complex relationship. That there's some really grandstand events where you say, right, yes, I want to be there, even though it's televised. I want to know, I want to sort of almost kind of say I was there. So there's an element of that involved in these broadcasting, but also that where it may sort of have that knock on is when Cheshire play, let's say Aylesbury in midweek. If that was on a sort of little feed on the internet that you could watch, there might be a time when you think, actually, do you know what? It's a miserable evening. I'm going to just watch it on my laptop instead. So you might find that those big event matches, people still go, but those sort of smaller, the kind of midweek games, you see it sometimes in the League Cup games, that people just, they run out of enthusiasm. So you might see the lesser midweek matches less attended. Also, what I think is worth thinking, if you think about, again, go back to my Cheshire versus Aylesbury, maybe that's too much of a big kind of crunch match. Let's say Cheshire versus, I don't know, let's say Dorchester, whatever. No one wants to go to Dorchester to watch a football match. Now, if that was the same night as, say, let's say Manchester United and Manchester City on telly, they're completely different leagues, but there may be a lot of people that say, actually, that is an event match. That's the big one that people are going to be talking about tomorrow, and I want to know that I watched it. So I want you to really come up with your ideas. Again, this is an area where there's not huge amounts of research, but I think it's useful to just give an idea of the topic. So explain that idea that the fear is that people don't attend. Explain whether you feel that's true, and kind of give your arguments. There's certain arguments to say that televising a match actually draws people in to watch it. There's certain argument to say that actually just the general sort of overload of football we have, whilst it might not be affecting those top leagues, could actually be having effect on those bottom leagues where people really, particularly those clubs where they really rely on those gate receipts. So the fact that there's Champions League matches, there's these big sort of midweek matches on show all the time, may actually have the effect of actually really changing gate receipts in those much smaller clubs. So that might be something to kind of reflect upon. So lastly, this one, I think this would be quite an easy one to attack, the influence of the media on football in terms of rule changes. I think it's just important to begin by just saying rule changes have arisen for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's about safety. So if you look at rugby, and I think to a certain extent there's some football, there's sort of very distinct concussion protocol. So if people have a head injury in rugby, there's they need to be assessed for a certain period of time, and then they have the capacity to come back on. There may be rules regarding blood injuries where people if people are sort of openly bleeding, they don't just sort of sit out now. They have time to sort of be tended to. In terms of the media, I think there's two things that you want to get across. So you sort of say rule changes have happened for a number of reasons. The main reasons associated with media is these two reasons. One is those that increase excitement, and those that arise due to the increased scrutiny that the media gives. Now, in 1990, the World Cup was, by all accounts, exceptionally dull. Now, you used to be able to pass back, so this meant that the keeper could, a defender could be in trouble, they could pass it back to the keeper, and they could pick it up, out of trouble. Now, this was used to waste a lot of time, so you could almost have people passing back from the halfway line. You could sort of mount an attack, realise you're not getting anywhere, whack it back to your keeper, reset. So if you think in the last kind of, let's say 10 minutes of a match, if you're 1-0 up, if you do that 4 times, you've probably killed 6-7 minutes of sort of time that you could be being attacked. So one of the rule changes was the back pass rule that you kind of know today, and that was really about taking away that option from defenders, and increasing that flow in a match, increasing the excitement. So that's quite an important thing to remember is that actually that was brought in really a little bit about, you know, the game just evolving and changing, but really from a media perspective it was boring to watch. So that was really sort of driven by sort of media and how the game presented itself on telly. The other thing I think is this other point about there being increased scrutiny, and what I think is quite interesting. I think there was a rule just brought in last year, or maybe for this season actually, about the goalkeeper having to have a foot on the goal line when the ball's struck, whatever, I can't remember. But a lot of that is because now the television cameras are so sharp that you pick up everything, and the more punditry analyses these things at the end of the game, the more the rule makers sort of go, well, hang on, the more the sort of FIFA look at it and go, so, well, you know, it isn't right that you get these goalkeepers sort of rushing out. So effectively there's these sort of two strands. There's one about how rule changes make the game more interesting to watch, and those that come about because of that raised scrutiny. And I want you to think of a couple for me. So I've just put a link here to say, what examples can you think of? So particularly in the last 2 years, the punditry has really sort of focused in on sort of people simulating fouls, and the idea of there being retrospective punishment. So this is quite an important thing that's come in. And so all I want you to do for this one is just sort of say, rule changes change. They really happen for these two main reasons: those that increase excitement, those that are due to that increased scrutiny of the match. I want you to give me some examples of those that come about through increased excitement, and I want you to give me some examples of those that come about due to increased scrutiny. You could summarise it by telling me what one you want. If you've watched a match, you know, I think sort of feigning injury or over exaggeration is a real scourge on the game at the minute. You know, I think it's a real pain. So give me some ideas about what you think should change. And then I think once you've covered that, you've kind of dipped into each of those topics, and you should have quite a nice assignment ready to go. So I was a little bit longer than I'd hoped, but again, use the planners that I've identified here, use the course book, and just do your best. I think you all know the game. There's some, I think there's some nice work you can get across to me, so I'll leave it in your hands.